Many of the diving videos on this channel focus on tragedies caused by human error. A diver goes into the water, makes a mistake, and then tragically drowns as a result, which, don't get me wrong, is horrifying. But for many, the far scarier reality is coming face to face with something else in the water. Something you can't control and something you can't stop. So in this video, we'll look at several terrifying incidents where people discovered they weren't alone. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In early October of 2024, in the waters near Timor-Leste, which is a country north of the Australian coast, a fisherman noticed something strange. A large shark ahead of his boat was behaving oddly. It was sluggish, like it was sick or injured. It wasn't swimming the way a healthy predator should, so thinking it might have swallowed plastic or gotten tangled in a net and was dying, the fisherman killed the animal and hauled it on board. Once he got it to land, he opened its belly to figure out what might have been going on, expecting to find a bunch of ocean garbage inside. What he found most certainly wasn't trash, though. Inside the shark's stomach were human remains. They appeared to come from a woman's body still wearing a black wetsuit and swimsuit. Then alongside it were other bits of diving gear. Word spread fast afterward and local officials got involved quickly, hoping to get to the bottom whether this was a shark attack, a tragic accident, or something else entirely. For anyone into diving or the ocean, it was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Colleen and her husband Mike were just getting started on a 7-week diving excursion through some of the most remote and pristine waters in the world. They had it all planned out, and when the time came to get things started, they could hardly believe it had finally arrived. At 68 years old, Colleen was no rookie either. She was a deeply experienced scuba diver. On September 26, 2024, she joined a small group that included Mike and 5 other friends diving off Pulau Rang, which is a tiny island in Indonesia's archipelago. The dive got underway just like any other. They weren't far from the boat and maybe about 23 feet or 7 meters below the surface. The water was crystal clear, and while there was a current, it was considered manageable. It was looking like it was going to be just another dreamlike day for the pair of diving enthusiasts, but as can happen even in the best conditions, things changed with little warning. The current shifted and Colleen started to break away from the group. The rest of the divers turned to adjust course, trying to avoid what looked like a downward current, which is essentially a vertical river underwater that can pull a diver deeper without warning. It's not unheard of in those waters, and the dive guide reacted quickly, but as the others regrouped, Colleen was gone. And while the dive guide tried his best to find her, he couldn't. In a matter of minutes, she had vanished into the current. What followed was an 8-day search across the area that included boats, divers, and aerial scans, but nothing turned up. Just a few days into what was meant to be a dream trip, Colleen's disappearance had transformed into a nightmare. Once the shark was found, at first, the identity of the body wasn't officially confirmed, but friends and family of Colleen were already bracing for the worst. A family friend, Kim, later confirmed that the body had been identified as Colleen's through fingerprint analysis. Even with the tragic confirmation though, one thing remained. Was her death the result of a diving accident, or was it a shark that killed her? The people who knew Colleen weren't buying the story that she was killed by a shark. Mike was adamant that Colleen didn't die in a shark attack, as were Kim and her husband Rick, both of whom were veteran divers who had run a dive shop together for 40 years. After reviewing Mike's dive computer, photos from the day, and anything else they could get their hands on, they were convinced the shark didn't kill her. It may have scavenged her body later, but it didn't cause her death. To them, everything pointed to an undetected medical issue that Colleen must have suffered during the dive. Kim, who said she had completed more than 1,000 dives with Colleen over the years, pointed out that sharks have incredibly acidic stomachs. They've evolved to break down cartilage and bone quickly. If Colleen had really been inside that shark for more than a week, her body would have been unrecognizable, but it wasn't. Her wetsuit was still intact and her fingerprints were still there. That just didn't line up with what's known about how sharks digest their food. And so to Colleen's family and friends, it was important to set the record straight and protect her legacy in some way. She wouldn't have wanted people to fear sharks because of what happened to her, and she certainly wouldn't have wanted a false story about how she left this world. In 2024, there were just 47 confirmed unprovoked shark bites reported across the entire world, which was the lowest number in nearly 30 years. And when it comes to fatal encounters, the numbers get even smaller. And to further put the chances into perspective, you're nearly 700 times more likely to be stung to death by hornets, bees, or wasps. And the global odds of dying in a shark attack currently sit at 1 in 28 million. For comparison, your odds of getting struck by lightning in your lifetime are about 1 in 15,000. So when Colleen's remains were found mostly intact after what would have been more than a week inside the animal, the conclusion was obvious to the people closest to Colleen. The shark may have been what found her, but it wasn't the shark that killed her. As of this video, the case of Colleen's death appears to still be under investigation. But with all of that said, even in the case that she wasn't attacked by a shark, and although shark attacks are exceptionally rare, that doesn't make them any less horrifying. When most people daydream about their next vacation, the mental images that usually come up are of sandy beaches, quiet resorts, and maybe a relaxing sightseeing tour. That's not exactly what Mark had in mind in 2005 when he booked a holiday that would have had most people preferring to remain behind in the safety of the office. The 32-year-old from England didn't fly all the way to South Africa for the beaches, wine tours, or the safaris. Instead, Mark had signed up to drop himself into a metal cage in the ocean that would be lowered into shark-infested waters. In March of that year, he arrived in the port town of Hermanus near Cape Town, which is famous for its whale watching excursions, but it's also one of the best places in the world to get an up-close look at great white sharks. On the morning of the dive, conditions were just about as perfect as anyone could have hoped for, and within minutes after departing Hermanus, the vessel arrived at the dive site and the crew began preparing the cage and chumming the surrounding waters in hopes of attracting any nearby sharks. And by the way, chumming the water means throwing bait in the water, like meat, fish remains, and blood. This apparently worked incredibly well because Mark wasn't even in the water yet when a couple of smaller sharks were spotted cruising near the surface. Then, without warning, a massive great white appeared, cutting through the water toward the now submerged cage before veering off and bypassing it. The captain estimated that it was about 18 feet or 5 meters, which was just slightly smaller than the boat itself. Turning back to Mark, the captain asked the obvious question of whether he still wanted to go down there. Mark apparently didn't miss a beat when he replied that he didn't come all the way not to do it. Handing his video camera off to another tourist, Mark climbed into the 8 by 3 foot or 2.5 by 1 meter cage and lowered himself into the water. This is typically a controlled, safe way to get up close and personal to these massive sharks. However, Mark had just barely gotten his bearings in the water when the great white shark returned, and this time it wasn't just passing through. The massive shark began circling the boat like it was working out a plan. Twice it looped around, then it lunged, ramming the side of the cage hard enough to rattle Mark inside. At first, Mark thought this was all normal. After all, he was in a stainless steel cage and the whole point was to get close to the sharks. But then the great white bit down on the bars, shaking the cage so violently that it made Mark feel like an ant in a jar. And with every crunch of the shark's jaws, the stainless steel cage felt a little less reassuring. Then one of the buoys keeping the cage afloat apparently popped under the force of a strike and the metal began to bend inward. The shark's attention then shifted to the open top of the cage, which let divers climb in and out, forcing Mark to stay low. Now, one of his many problems at that moment was that he wasn't on any kind of breathing apparatus. He was only wearing a mask, so every few seconds he'd have to dodge the shark and surface for air. Each time he did, he heard the passengers on the boat above screaming in panic, but Mark would continually return to the bottom of the cage, believing this was all part of the experience. As this was all going on, the captain was trying to distract the shark, and at one point he apparently began striking it on the top of its head with an iron pole, but the blows only seemed to agitate the situation even more. Then, because of the popped buoy, the cage began to sink, and that's when Mark realized his two options were to stay under and risk drowning or head back to the surface and risk being eaten. Given that he actually didn't really have a choice because he would drown if he didn't surface, he quickly made his move, again swimming to the top of the cage and this time out of the opening before surfacing. He then reached for the captain's outstretched hand and grabbed it. One slip and he would have fallen right into the shark's gaping mouth. Somehow though, he made it onto the deck with his heart pounding and every limb still accounted for. This all happened in the span of just minutes, but Mark got the store he flew all the way for. For anyone watching from the boat that day, it would have been easy to label the shark as a bloodthirsty killing machine. And to be fair, the footage of it thrashing against the cage didn't exactly help its public image, but conservationists and shark experts see it differently. Experts believe what happened to Mark wasn't an attempted feeding so much as a case of what they call mouthing. This is a combination of curiosity and testing its environment. In other words, the shark may have been investigating the strange metal intruder in its space, not trying to make Mark its lunch. Mark's story, however, seemed to contradict that, and he wasted little time in sharing it. Once back on dry land, he didn't seem shaken so much as exhilarated, and the media rushed to hear what he had to say. In interviews, he recalled the experience as a thrill and even went on to say it was the best thing he ever did. Facing a great white head-on, having it attack the cage, and walking away to tell of it was that once-in-a-lifetime story Mark was looking for from his vacation. But the story didn't just make headlines, it also caused some trouble. The company that organized the trip sued Mark and several media outlets in the aftermath for sensationalizing what really happened. They claimed his account had been exaggerated in a way that hurt their business. The captain, they said, had no memory of hitting the shark with an iron pole, and there was never a point where Mark was fighting for his life. According to them, the cage was fixed securely to the boat and was never in any danger of sinking, and the shark had only bitten through a fender, which was not uncommon when chum is in the water. Mark, however, stood by his version of the story, pointing to photographs and footage taken that day. One image in particular apparently showed the cage mangled after the encounter. This was visual proof, he argued, that this wasn't just a harmless brush with a mouthing great white shark. There was even another piece of footage that showed how close Mark had come to losing an arm. In any case, for most people, a run-in with a great white shark would be the kind of experience that ends any future plans involving open water, but Mark wasn't most people. When asked if he'd ever go into a cage to face a great white shark again, Mark confidently stated that he would. As you're probably aware, there's no such thing as a white snowy Christmas in Argentina. Its location in the southern hemisphere means the country experiences its summer during the month of December, and in 2013, there was no escaping the heat of the season. The city of Rosario sits about 300 kilometers north of Buenos Aires and was in the grips of a brutal heat wave. In fact, early on Christmas morning, temperatures were already soaring to another day in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 Celsius. And while Christmas traditions generally include exchanging presents, very few in and around Rosario could think of a better gift than a day in the cool waters of the Piranha River. People from all around flocked there, and by mid-morning, both the banks and the muddy waters were packed with those looking for a little relief from the climbing heat. Families clustered on the sands as kids shrieked and splashed in the water. These sounds of relief and fun, however, quickly turned into screams of absolute terror as midday approached. At first, these were isolated, but within moments, the number of people shouting in full-throated screams of pain and fear had spread. Swimmers in the water then thrashed toward the shore as those on land tried to make sense of what was going on. Some of those who were in the water were clutching their hands or limping on injured feet as they left thin trails of blood behind them in the brown water. In the shallows, parents waded in without hesitation to grab their children and drag or carry them back to the safety of the banks. This all happened within just a few brief moments, from the first sign of fear to the chaos of confusion that followed. As dozens of people who had been in the river when the screaming started began to take stock of their injuries, what happened that morning came into view. Jagged chunks were missing from some swimmers, while others lost parts of their fingers or toes. These were the undeniable signs of a sudden and violent piranha feeding frenzy. The culprits, as it would turn out, were a species known as palomeras. They're a large, aggressive member of the piranha family, known for razor-sharp teeth and a bite that can shear through flesh in an instant. They're not the mindless man-eaters of horror movies, but when they strike in numbers, the effect can be devastating. That Christmas morning, they swarmed on the swimmers in the Piranha River, and by the time it was over, more than 70 people had been injured. At least 20 of them were children, and 7 of them lost parts of their fingers or toes. One girl even had the tip of a finger bitten clean off. These attacks came in rapid bursts, with the fish disappearing as quickly as they appeared, only to re-emerge a few feet away. Even people who thought they'd escaped with a single bite found themselves stuck again before they could even make it out of the water. And for parents trying to pull their children to safety, every second in the shallows felt like an eternity. Now, in Rosario, piranha bites aren't unheard of. The Piranha River is home to plenty of carnivorous fish, and now and then, a swimmer will come away with a small wound. This was something else entirely, though. The city's emergency services director said in his decades on the job, he had never seen so many people injured in such a short span of time. Just a few years earlier, in 2008, 40 swimmers were hurt in a similar palometa attack, but this one nearly doubled that, and the scale of the injuries was far more severe. After things had settled down, why it happened became the big question, and the answer isn't entirely clear. The most obvious explanation is thought to be the weather. With Rosario in the midst of a punishing heat wave, thousands of people had flocked to the river for relief, and more bodies in the water meant more opportunities for contact with the fish. The heat also apparently changes the behavior of the palometas themselves. Officials said the unusually warm waters brought the fish closer to the surface, where they were more likely to encounter swimmers. Warmer water also apparently speeds up their metabolism, making them more aggressive feeders. Simultaneously, some locals claim that human activity upriver acted as bait, or discarded fish parts from nearby fishermen may have lured the palometas to the area. Others suggested a combination of factors, including scarce natural food sources, environmental stress, and a sudden abundance of slow-moving prey splashing at the surface. But whatever the reason, that morning the conditions just seemed to be perfect for an aggressive feeding frenzy. Piranhas belong to a group of freshwater fish found throughout South America's rivers, lakes, and floodplains. Exactly how many species is still debated, as some scientists say fewer than 30, and others put the number in excess of 60, but all of them share the same unmistakable dental design. They all have tightly packed rows of razor-sharp teeth made for consuming and tearing apart flesh. Their reputation as mindless killers, however, is exaggerated, but it's not entirely without basis. Most of the time, piranhas are opportunistic omnivores, eating smaller fish, insects, plant matter, and the occasional carcass. They don't typically go after humans unless they're provoked, food is scarce, or environmental conditions like low water levels or high temperatures push them to be more aggressive. The Christmas Day 2013 incident was a rare reminder of what these fish are capable of under the right conditions. The Kali River runs between India and Nepal, cutting through steep valleys and dense jungle before joining the Gagara River. And for the people who live along its banks, the river is both a lifeline and a danger. It provides water, fish, and transport, but it also has a reputation for strong currents and hidden hazards beneath the surface. Among those hazards is one fish that's earned a darker reputation than most, something known as the Goonch catfish. Locals call it the giant devil catfish, and it's not hard to see why. Goonch catfish are bottom dwellers that can grow to more than 6 feet or 2 meters long and weigh in excess of 150 pounds or 68 kilos, making them some of the largest freshwater catfish in the world. And they aren't picky eaters either. Fish, frogs, small mammals, pretty much anything that adds them to the water is on the menu. What really sets these fish apart in local legend, though, is the idea that some of these fish may have developed a taste for human flesh. Along stretches of the river, it's common for funeral pyres to be set up on the river banks. Tradition calls for releasing ashes and sometimes half-burnt human remains into the water. And over time, some villagers came to believe that this practice gave the Goonch an unusual source of food, encouraged them to grow larger than normal and bolder than expected. By the late 1990s, stories began circulating of Goonch that weren't just scavenging anymore. Instead, they were attacking. The first recorded incident happened in April of 1998. A 17-year-old boy named Dill was swimming in the Kali River when something grabbed him. Eyewitnesses, including a friend who was with him in the water, watched in shock as Dill was pulled under in an instant. The search that followed covered more than 5 kilometers of the river over 3 days, but tragically, no trace of him was ever found. Then, only a few months later, another tragedy struck. In a small village, a young boy was swimming near his father when he was suddenly dragged under in the same way. His father could only watch, powerless, as his son disappeared beneath the surface, and once again, no body was ever recovered. For almost a decade, the river stayed quiet until 2007, when an 18-year-old Nepalese man vanished while swimming in nearly the same stretch of water. Villagers described the creature responsible as a mud-covered water pig, a phrase that captured just how strange and out of place it seemed. So this meant 3 disappearances occurred, spread out over 9 years, all within a 6-kilometer section of river. The similarities were impossible to ignore as bodies were dragged under in plain sight with no remains ever found. This left locals convinced that something unusual was lurking in the Kali. News of these strange attacks eventually caught the attention of Jeremy Wade, a British biologist and angler who had built a reputation on tracking down freshwater giants. You might be familiar with Jeremy as his Discovery television show River Monsters thrived on them, but the idea of a fish dragging people under and leaving no remains was on another level. And at first, he was skeptical. The Kali River, after all, is home to crocodiles, and India's coastline isn't far from where bull sharks have been known to travel upriver. Natural hazards like whirlpools also couldn't be ruled out. Still, the details didn't quite fit those explanations. The water in the northern stretch of the Kali was too cold for one species called mugger crocodiles, and saltwater crocodiles didn't travel that far inland. The gharial, another native species, also had jaws that were far too narrow to tackle something as large as a human. Bull sharks, again, were still a possibility, but none had ever been seen in that part of the river, and whirlpools didn't explain why victims vanished in relatively calm waters. But when Jeremy visited the villages along the river, he heard the same story again and again. It wasn't just a crocodile or shark. It was the Goonch, according to locals. The fish had grown massive from years of feeding on funeral remains, and some believed one particular specimen had turned it into a man-eater. Now, Jeremy had heard plenty of tall tales in his career, but this one was consistent enough and chilling enough that he decided to investigate it for himself. He began in a section of the Kali River where the attacks had taken place. Using sonar equipment, he first ruled out the idea of whirlpools or strong eddies pulling swimmers under. The riverbed was relatively flat and calm in the areas where victims had disappeared, making that explanation unlikely. Soon after making this measurement, Jeremy heard about a water buffalo that had been dragged underwater while drinking at the river's edge, in water only about 3 feet or 1 meter deep. For an animal of that size to vanish so quickly, the predator had to have weighed at least 200 pounds or 91 kilos, in Jeremy's estimation. That meant something much larger than a typical fish was in play. So one by one, Jeremy began ruling out the usual suspects, the various crocodiles and sharks. That left only the Goonch. And in fact, during underwater dives afterward, Jeremy and his team spotted several of the massive catfish. Some of them were even as long as men and thick-bodied enough to make the idea of an attack seem possible. These weren't the typical bottom-feeding catfish most people imagine. They were predators in their own right, and if one had grown big enough and bold enough, it could explain the mysterious disappearances. So Jeremy set up a dummy funeral pyre near the riverbank, hoping to lure one in. It was a grim tactic, but it made sense. If the fish had learned to associate pyres with food, the plan could draw one out. After hours of waiting and several failed attempts, Jeremy finally hooked onto something massive. The fight afterward was unlike anything he'd experienced before. The fish pulled hard against the line, thrashing in the current with surprising strength, and at one point Jeremy had to jump into the river himself to stop it from escaping. When he finally hauled it to the shore, the creature was revealed. And it was indeed a goonch weighing 160 pounds or 72.5 kilos, stretching more than 5 feet or 1.5 meters long. Then the next day he caught an even larger one, this one coming in at 5 feet 7 inches or 1.7 meters in length and tipping the scales at 161 pounds. This was nearly 3 times the size of an average goonch. Both fish were record-breaking examples of the species and proof that the river really did harbor giants. But even with the catches, Jeremy was cautious. As big as they were, he wasn't convinced either of them was an actual man-eater. An animal of that size could take a child for sure, but the victims had been teenagers and adults. That suggested there might be an even larger fish still hidden in the river's depths. In the end, Jeremy's investigation didn't find anything larger. He had caught massive goonch catfish that were big enough to prove that the river held extraordinary examples of the species, but not so massive that they could easily account for dragging down grown men. Still, the possibility couldn't be dismissed. If a goonch could reach 160 pounds on a diet of ordinary river food, what might happen if one had decades of feeding on human funeral remains? Villagers were convinced that such a monster existed, and Jeremy himself admitted that larger individuals could still be lurking in the Kali River. So today, the case of the 3 attacks remains unsettled, particularly because no bodies were ever recovered to study. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.